Good morning, team. For those who haven't met yet, I'm David Wheel, and I'm currently a pre-service teacher at USQ, completing my MSLT degree majoring in business and economics. As pre-service teachers, we are constantly identifying, researching, and implementing different pedagogical strategies and learning activities to create a teacher personality that we hope to implement within our classrooms when we graduate. Recently, I've conducted some professional development activities, which I identified Indigenous teaching pedagogy as an area of learning opportunity which will improve my overall teaching practice. Based on the activities, I've completed a literature review of some key pieces that explain the significance of Indigenous teaching pedagogies and some of the barriers that teachers currently face. From there, I'll explain the 8 Ways Pedagogical Framework, which is the most researched back Indigenous pedagogy that is implemented in schools today. Once the theory has been covered, I will talk about my action plan to implement better Indigenous teaching practices within my lesson planning and overall improvements of inclusiveness for all students. Lastly, I'll establish parameters on how the action plan will be evaluated and reflected to improve on for future year levels. Firstly, a little about my APST's evaluation. Recently, I completed the AITSL Teacher Self-Assessment of APSTs, which is designed to identify areas of the APSTs that you thrive within, but also other areas where you may need additional assistance or professional development to further develop your teaching. My research showed an expected gap in development with a graduate level of knowledge in APSTs 2.4, which talks about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander reconciliation. During my schooling career, I've had minimal exposure to Indigenous education and have learnt most of my knowledge through this degree. APST 2.4 also affects the ability to understand and teach all students in my classroom, and consequently, APSTs 1.3, 1.4, and 4.1 were graded at a graduate level, which all relate to knowing how students learn. Because of this, Indigenous pedagogy and inclusiveness became my focus topic for this assignment. The starting steps to understanding Indigenous education and pedagogies is to conduct a literature review of key articles that establish the benefits of including Indigenous practices within a classroom, but also the limitations or barricades that currently face the teaching industry with trying to include Indigenous perspectives within the learning environment. The first article that I studied was written by Yana Kano in 2005 and speaks about the perceptions of teachers towards integrating Indigenous cultures, knowledge, and content into high school curriculum and an attempt to increase participation, sense of belonging, and retention amongst Indigenous students. Through observations, teachers' journals, and pedagogical testing within classrooms, teachers expressed a belief towards integrating Indigenous perspectives into curriculum would result in a drastic change towards academic success and retention rates of Indigenous students, whilst also providing a sense of belonging towards being within the classroom. However, teachers raised two major concerns. Firstly, uncertainty towards best teaching practices to integrate cultural knowledge and perspectives within the classroom without changing the whole curriculum, which is also supported by Banks in 1989. Additionally, there were concerns regarding teachers' own understanding and knowledge of Indigenous cultures, which limited their ability of integration into the classroom. The other concern is that teachers have made personal financial contributions to gathering Indigenous resources within the classroom and to community speakers to come in and present to the class, indicating that a lack of funding could be a potential barrier that is faced within the industry. Some small notes about Kano's research, which may have influenced results, are that this research was conducted prior to the change in recognition of Indigenous histories and cultures within Australia, and the mindset towards including Indigenous cultures in everyday life, not just in schools, has drastically improved since then. Also, all teachers who were involved in the study were either social studies or native awareness teachers who have a specialised interest in this topic. These results may have changed if general curriculum courses such as maths and science were included in the report. The second article that I researched was written by Rhonda Craven in 2020, where she studied how to improve the mindset and mentality towards teaching Indigenous cultures and histories within school. A project school within a heavily populated Indigenous area was nominated to implement Indigenous pedagogical strategies, and observations were taken down to evaluate the effectiveness of improving Indigenous academic performance. The school found by implementing these strategies that it strengthened the policy, planning, and quality of teaching resources towards Indigenous education. It also engaged Indigenous students to apply cultural knowledge into classrooms, which was reinforced by including presentations by community representatives and resulted in improved academic results for Indigenous students. Like Kanu, there was an established focus towards needing professional development for teachers and to improve their understanding and suggestions on how to include Indigenous perspectives within the classroom. The suggestions within this article would help provide a stronger education for Indigenous students, however, are suggested under the premise of sufficient funding being provided, which has been spoken about previously as a known barrier within the education industry. Teachers require extensive professional development opportunities to reach the goal of excellent teaching, which is stated in the article. However, there is limited research into the most efficient way to achieve this goal. Lastly, I reviewed Brian Luthwaite and his colleagues' report, which was written in 2015, about changing the pedagogical viewpoints towards teaching Indigenous students based on feedback from Indigenous parents within the community and also Indigenous students within the school. The review was conducted by open-ended interviews, which allowed participants to provide their viewpoint on current curriculum guidelines and how they perceive teachers' implementation of Indigenous perspectives into classroom learning goals. Many interviewees were supportive of the engagement and learning adjustments in policies for Indigenous students and stated that it created effective opportunities for teachers to implement better Indigenous practices within the classroom. Overall, the academic improvement of all students were observed, not just by Indigenous students. As the article was aimed towards pedagogical viewpoints, Luthwaite's team suggests that there is a lack of evidence towards the viewpoints of community members towards Indigenous pedagogies and the effects that it may have on Indigenous students. Within this report, the evaluation was solely focused on the improvement of academic results as a successful parameter of implementation of Indigenous perspectives, and raises the question of whether inclusiveness and other areas that aren't data-driven were considered within the report. Across these articles were four main key themes that were described by all authors. Firstly, and the most prominent one, is the lack of teacher education and professional development opportunities that are available for teachers to improve on Indigenous cultures, histories, and knowledge to implement within their classroom. As these practices have shown to improve academic performance for all students and not just Indigenous students, it is important for better professional opportunities to be available. The improvement in academic performance by students occurs due to the incorporation of Indigenous perspectives and has increased Indigenous student engagement, retention, and overall sense of belonging, encouraging Indigenous students to complete their schooling careers. Lastly, if teachers are encouraging the embedding of Indigenous practices within curriculum, then strengthening of school policies to encourage and enable stronger Indigenous perspectives may change aspects such as funding and resource allocations, which have been identified as common barriers amongst all reports that could change the perspectives and opportunities to implement Indigenous practices into classrooms and the curriculum. Another identified barrier that the reports discuss was the lack of knowledge of knowing by teachers on how to implement Indigenous perspectives into their pedagogy. However, there is one pedagogical framework that is heavily researched and helps incorporate Indigenous perspectives alongside the current Australian curriculum. The 8 Ways Pedagogical Framework is an approach that is designed to embed Indigenous perspectives within the current Australian curriculum, without the need to completely change the aspects of the modern classroom. The pedagogy is based around the practices of telling a story, planning, thinking, doing, and drawing, then exploring the outside land whilst trying to find new ways of interpreting information based on the nature around you. Finally, watching first, doing, and then sharing with others, which is a learning sequence that has been a part of Indigenous cultures and histories for as long as records show. These practices are consolidated into 8 interconnected segments that are used as points of dialogue within the classroom. Originally created in 2007 as a result from a research project in Indigenous studies, 8 Ways Pedagogy focuses on acknowledging traditional keepers of knowledge in Indigenous communities alongside the learning goals within the Australian curriculum. This creates an inclusive learning environment for all students to succeed. The name 8 Ways is based off the design of the 8 interconnected segments and are labelled as deconstruct, reconstruct, learning maps, community links, symbols and images, non-verbal, land links, story sharing, and non-linear. This pedagogy embeds Indigenous perspectives into classrooms whilst keeping the focus on the main learning goals within the Australian curriculum. These segments work towards providing an explicit Indigenous pedagogy that encourages academic performance of Indigenous learners whilst providing a common ground for all learners to culturally understand Indigenous histories and perspectives. Embedding Indigenous processes and values within the classroom assists with understanding the thought processing and pathways that different cultures participated in, expanding the concept of critical thinking within students. Some processes and values that are seen within the 8 Ways pedagogy are describing stories that were shared, the knowledge of art and objects, working from whole to parts before trying yourself, and relaying knowledge to those at home. Planning the implementation of new pedagogical frameworks is just as important as researching and understanding and requires an action plan for future lessons. The implementation of an action plan shows understanding of research and provides a learning platform to later reflect on ideas and evaluate execution of plans. The importance of having an action plan as a teacher, most seen in the form of lesson and unit planning, provides evidence and justification for learning goals and activities within the classroom, especially when trying to implement a new pedagogical strategy such as 8 Ways. Within the action plan are 3 key goals that I wish to achieve by the end of the expected timeline. Based off the literature review and incorporating the pedagogical segments of 8 Ways, my first key goal is to incorporate community recognition within the classroom. In a business classroom, this could be involving Indigenous operated businesses in the local community within learning activities, or involving community business owners to give classroom speeches about their journey. This then complements the next goal of cultural understanding and including Indigenous perspectives within learning goals in the classroom. Inclusive teaching practices have been shown to improve academic performances of students as per the literature review. These practices can also create a sense of belonging for students, which improves retention rate and increases the number of students who complete Year 12 and achieve their QCE. Lastly, my personal professional development will be an ongoing goal that will never have a finish date, as you can never be 100% expert on a topic. Locating and engaging in professional learning opportunities such as a seminar or online lectures will further develop my understanding of Indigenous learning activities that can not only assist students, but provide the opportunity for me to assist other teachers who may be interested in the same subject. I'm fortunate enough to have signed a PTT contract for Term 1 next year, and therefore can create a realistic timeline for my key goals. As I'll still be a university student for Term 1 next year, and Term 2 will be my first official term as a teacher, I'm allowing myself some time to adjust to my new working conditions before I look to adjust my own pedagogical strategies. By the end of Term 3, I am wanting to have planned lessons that incorporate Indigenous practices within learning activities. This provides ample planning time and ensures that I best prepare for an effective presentation. In Term 4, I would like to implement these lessons and will also start the evaluation and reflection process of these lessons to further improve them for future cohorts. Organising a community speak up, whether for a class or whole cohort, is a lengthy process that requires extensive planning. I've moved this goal to Term 1 of 2026 to allow myself to get through my first year of teaching before organising my first big event within the classroom, and permits time to ensure all risk assessment forms and required paperwork are filled out. This also gives me time to find a suitable person for the learning goals that is being worked towards. As mentioned, my professional development goal will be an ongoing goal that is consistently worked on, as you can never be a 100% expert on a topic. Reading, listening, and observing different practices will constantly improve my own implementation of Indigenous teaching strategies. I've provided some examples of how I would effectively implement Indigenous learning activities within the classroom that are supported by the 8 Ways pedagogical framework and that are relevant to a business classroom. Product design, investigating an entrepreneur's business journey, and creative thinking towards business ideas are all part of the descriptors within the business curriculum that also complement segments of the 8 Ways pedagogy. When implementing a new strategy or activity within a classroom, it is important to reflect and evaluate the effectiveness of the implementation to ensure that students are receiving the required learning, both in understanding and knowledge. Additionally, you can make positive adjustments for future cohorts to further improve learning opportunities. When implementing new strategies within a classroom, it is recommended to follow these 4 steps to effectively improve teaching practices. Firstly, observe the new practice in effect, focusing on students' change in behaviour, academic performance from exit tickets, in-class learning activities, and students' confidence or inclusiveness within the classroom. This produces the data to reflect on and evidence of adjustments that need to be made. Next step is to record these observations into a notebook or document, as this can be done whilst class is occurring, providing real-time thoughts on observations for you to reflect on later. From there, bring your findings to a collaboration group, another teacher or head of department who is aware of the implementations occurring, to discuss your findings and share suggestions of improvements. Lastly, allocate time to replan the lesson activities and plans to improve the implementation for future year levels or future lesson plans that may be occurring. By following this process, you conduct a thorough review of new teaching strategies that are supported by research and collaboration with other teachers, to create a thoroughly researched teaching pedagogy that provides great opportunities for students to academically succeed within your classroom. However, it is just as important to self-reflect on your own teaching practices as it is on the effectiveness of the learning activities. Self-reflecting on your own teaching practices can help create reciprocal links between received and experienced knowledge, which then improve your teaching skills overall. It is a crucial part of teaching, as no cohort group is the same and require different techniques to provide the best opportunities for students to academically succeed. As teachers, it is part of our role to determine best practices for all students and to adjust our learning goals and activities to suit the student cohort. Factors that need to be considered when self-reflecting are classroom environments and the improvement of inclusiveness among students, with a focus towards Indigenous students when implementing 8 Ways pedagogical strategies. This will determine if the class has adapted well to the new strategies. From this, you can then observe the change in students' academic performance, engagement, and understanding of learning goals and activities. As effective as new pedagogical strategies can be, if students are not understanding the main learning goals and content, there is little support as to why those teaching practices should continue. Lastly, reflect on your own performances and how smoothly did the new strategy be presented. Was there a lot of disruptions? Did the teaching style feel smooth? If the smoothness of the lesson was disrupted and lost the engagement from students due to this, then again, those teaching strategies are not supported to continue being used within a classroom. Self-reflection is just as important as evaluating the pedagogical strategies and should be completed and reviewed simultaneously with replanning of the lesson. Overall, when reviewing the AITSL Teacher's Self-Assessment of APSTs, it was identified that I need to improve my knowledge and understanding of Indigenous teaching strategies within the classroom. From this information, I conducted a literature review of key reports that supported Indigenous education and pedagogical strategies that shape current stances towards Indigenous education. The 8 Ways pedagogical framework demonstrated a heavily researched and supported teaching pedagogy that helps embed Indigenous perspectives alongside the Australian curriculum without having to completely change the classroom environment. This pedagogy assists Indigenous students have a sense of belonging within a classroom and improves engagement and retention rates amongst Indigenous students, improving the number of students who complete Year 12 and achieve their QCE. Through my action plan that includes key goals of community recognition, cultural understanding, and professional development, I've made a detailed timeline to implement these strategies into my classroom to endorse Indigenous perspectives within a business classroom, teaching students of local community Indigenous operated businesses and entrepreneurs. Once this is all implemented, the important steps of evaluation and self-reflection will constantly improve my teaching strategies to create a learning environment for all students to academically succeed. I thank you for listening to my presentation and hope this has assisted you in learning more about Indigenous education and encourage you to try some of these ideas within your own classroom.